Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Everybody wants to be happy, right? Especially at this time of year when it's the holiday season. It's all about family, friends, giving, a higher purpose in life. And even if this time gives us some happiness, well, then Boxing Day comes and it's over. And then we're back to the worries and grind of everyday life. Happiness seems so fleeting and difficult to hold on to for many of us. Do we really know what happiness is? And if we do we know how to achieve it? Well, apparently we do. We do know something about happiness. There's actually a science around it. There are happiness researchers who study it. They do experiments. They look at the evidence of what makes people happy around the world. Lara Aknin is one of them. She's a social psychologist. She's also a professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University. And she's a co-editor for the United Nations World Happiness Report, which comes out every year. And she joins us. Hi, Lara. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Well, if there is a science around happiness, I think this is news to many people. I guess there must also be an agreed upon definition of what happiness is.
Yeah. So most researchers who are studying well-being science or the science of happiness usually focus on one central kind of leading definition that has this tri-part model. And that means it proposes three parts. So the first focuses on how you feel primarily in the moment, looking at both the experience of positive affect or short-term positive emotions and the absence of negative or negative emotions. So for instance, you might feel short-term momentary pleasure from eating an ice cream, from having a coffee with a friend, from seeing a smile on your kid's face. And you might have lower levels of positive affect from just the absence of those things. We can also experience high levels of negative affect from stubbing our toe, from receiving a bad grade or some negative feedback. All of those things kind of capture the more short-term momentary experiences of these positive and negative emotions. And that represents two of the facets. One interesting thing to point out before I name the third and final component is that although we might often think of these positive and negative parts of happiness as two opposite ends of one pole, they're actually thought to be what researchers call orthogonal, so such that you could experience both high or low levels of these two things simultaneously. That might seem weird at first, but if you think about it, there are many experiences that can be bittersweet.
Right.
One of the most striking for me is when I dropped my child off at daycare for the first time. There was a lot of sadness when, he just took off and didn't even look back at me, but also a lot of pride and satisfaction that came from, seeing him kind of happily march off into his own little place. And so we can experience these two emotions simultaneously. They don't necessarily come at the expense of one another. So those are the short-term emotions. And the third final component I haven't measured is a more big picture kind of cognitive or holistic evaluation of our lives that we often call satisfaction with one's life. It doesn't often fluctuate from moment to moment. So people who are happy with their lives, they might feel tinges of sadness, and someone who's a 7 out of 10 on a scale, might some days rate themselves as an 8 and some days rate themselves as a 6, but they're often not bumping around from a 3 to a 7, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's interesting.
Stable. It's a pretty stable measurement. And in some ways that makes sense. Your current mood might color how you view your life as a whole, but many of the life characteristics are not changing wildly from day to day, such that people's life evaluations are not changing wildly from day to day.
Right. Yeah. So then what about having a possible, predisposition to happiness or how you're born, right? With some, I don't even know if there's a happiness gene.
Yeah. Some other leading models on happiness suggest, and what we know from genetic-based studies and twin-based studies, which are informative because people have similar genes. You can look at monozygotic and dizygotic twins to see, and you can know exactly the level of genetic overlap and similarity in similar and different environments. Leading models suggest that about 50% of our happiness levels can be based in genetics. So it's influential. It's a major component, but it's also worth knowing that that's not the full picture. Happy parents have happier children, and the reverse, but things can change. They can ebb and flow through various important life situations and the way we structure our lives.
I saw a video. It was a talk that you gave on the science of happiness. And I was really intrigued at the beginning. And you said you often ask a question at the beginning to the audience about how they would rate their happiness now and in the future. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So, one way to get us thinking about the science of happiness, and particularly what our intuitions might be about what makes us happy, is to think about, well, first, rate your current happiness. I mean, you could invite people to do that on a scale from 0 to 10, where, 10 might be the best possible life for you and 0 might be the lowest possible life for you. And most people, for what it's worth, don't have too much trouble pegging an answer. And a question like this represents a very common measure used actually by the Gallup World Poll, and is often kind of the key piece of the World Happiness Report, called the Cantrell ladder. So people can imagine where they are on this scale, peg an answer, and then usually what I invite people to do is to kind of daydream about what an ideal life might be for them in 5-10 years from now, and let people, have their minds wander. For some people, that might be moving to a tropical island with their best friend or their partner. For some people, that might be, earning a certain income. For some people, that might be finding a dream partner or having kids. Everybody comes up with their own personal story, and I don't necessarily ask them to share it. But then I ask them to rate how they think, what they think their happiness would be should that dream life come true. And usually people, by a quick show of hands, will be very forthcoming and say, yep, I would be happier with that dream life than I am now. And I think that can be pretty revealing as people reflect on what this dream life is in their minds, but what we think makes us happier. And some of these things, I suspect, I haven't interrogated people's intuitions, but if we were to make a list, it's often around money and relationships. Sometimes it's about social status. Sometimes it's about geographic location. But all of these ideas kind of raise some interesting possibilities about what people think make them happy. And I think the science of well-being is trying to unpack and consider whether many of these things do truly have an impact.
So what I find interesting about that, and so what I want to know is, when people first give a number and they peg their happiness in the present day, right? Just generally how happy they are. Mm-hmm. Do you find that it falls within a certain range? I'm just kind of wondering, like, how happy do people say they are?
Generally, so normally in Canada, the mean is somewhere between, in a large nationally representative survey, I believe it's somewhere between usually around 6 to 7. Most people, generally speaking, around the world, but especially in places where a lot of data have been collected, which tends to be wealthier nations, there's a positive bias. So it's not that the average population mean is right around the midpoint of the scale, but rather that there's generally a positive bias in most people, suggesting that most people are above the midpoint, feeling somewhat happy. That's like their resting place, if you will.
See, I find that interesting, because do you think that people generally think they're unhappier, but then when they're pushed to make an actual decision on it and a number, they rate themselves higher? I don't know why I'm feeling that. Just because generally when I talk to people and they complain a lot about their lives, or they think they could be happier, or they need more of this, or they want that.
Yeah.
I get this sense that they're not that happy. And yet you're saying to me, they tend to, and this is in wealthier nations, as you say, but like Canada, they tend to skew a bit higher than the average, than the midpoint.
They're above the midpoint of the scale. And I guess the point is that the average is positive in many of our estimates. Yeah. There are, the World Happiness Report kind of does show average happiness levels by nation using Gallup World Poll data, which is nationally representative samples around the world. And it is not above the midpoint of a scale everywhere. But in many places, in wealthier nations especially, and those that have strong social networks and support systems, the mean is positive. So yeah, it's interesting. I think people do complain sometimes, and especially with close friends and people we care about, we might share our frustrations. But generally speaking, the data do tend to show a mean above the midpoint of a scale.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
That's really, that's great. So, what have you found from your research and other people's research about fundamentally what does make us happy?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it suggests a lot of answers. I think one of the most robust predictors of happiness around the globe seems to be social connection, social contact, having close and meaningful relationships with other people. There's one central item that seems to capture just the most basic form of human connection, which simply asks people, do you have someone to count on in times of need? And people who say yes to this measure are way likelier to report higher happiness than people who do not. And so it seems like just having at least one person that you can count on is really, really important. There are other ways to capture social support that are bigger, more extended measures. But generally speaking, it seems to tell a very consistent story that when people feel they have these close and meaningful connections with other people, they're happier for it. Even some new research showing the less obvious candidates for social connection. So I think most of the time when we think about social connection as an important contributor to our happiness, we think about, our romantic partners or our close friends, maybe our kids, our insular social network. But even having a sense of community and even talking to strangers in recent research has been suggested to improve our momentary happiness. It's not necessarily going to change someone's life satisfaction, at least not a one-time encounter with a stranger. But in moments after we have these brief but pleasant conversations with strangers, people are reporting higher levels of happiness. And this has been shown numerous times over the past couple of years. And I think it kind of taps into this really important sense that we're very social creatures, and these brief moments of connection and conversation with others can do enough to kind of boost our momentary happiness.
Okay, that's fascinating. Even conversations with strangers. So, it makes me then wonder whether there's concern among, researchers and maybe the United Nations about moving towards a more virtual world. And if we end up losing opportunities to, and not even just strangers, but coworkers, right? Because we're working at home, and even maybe friends and extended family members. So if we actually lose those opportunities, are we losing opportunities for happiness?
I think some forms of digital communication like Zoom and whatnot can serve interesting proxies. We may miss these like close interpersonal, meaningful contact points, but it may also open up opportunities. Like you and I are on opposite sides of the country right now, and without this platform, we wouldn't be able to talk at all, or we'd have to use some form of additional. We're not going to be meeting in person today, I don't think. So it does afford some opportunities for connection that may have been missing before. But I do think the whole the proliferation of electronic devices in ways that we have not co-evolved with until the last several decades does raise some important challenges for human connection. There's some really fascinating work by Kosta Kushlev at Georgetown, who's been finding that when people have their digital devices with them, they're less likely to engage in conversations with strangers, and just as you proposed, Mary, miss out on opportunities that may bring connection and happiness. And so I do think that is. It's a point, it's something we may not realize. We think we carry our phones as a point of convenience, and sometimes it allows us to dodge conversations when we don't want them. But the interesting thing is most people don't think talking to strangers is going to make them happy. And in fact, they willfully avoid it, right? they walk the other way, they cross the
That's
street,
true.
they sit on the opposite side of the bus because they don't want to engage in these conversations. I think it also raises some interesting discussion points about how people don't always know what makes them happy. It's not like we're completely out of touch with reality, but we're also not the best introspectors on this point.
Yeah. Can you talk about that and how that's been illustrated? Because I have to say, that's one thing that really struck me, that many people don't know what makes them happy.
So in short, people do have a general sense of what it is that makes them happy. Like we know that, an afternoon with friends is going to make us happier than perhaps, sitting at the dentist or sitting out in the rain. It's not like we know positive things are going to be unpleasant and bad stuff is going to be rewarding. So people grasp those basic details. But where people tend to predictably falter is that they tend to think their emotional response to events is going to be much more extreme and long lasting than it typically is. So for instance, if people think about an upcoming promotion or a breakup, they tend to assume that their emotional response will be way more elated and way more crushed than they might actually be. And they think that these emotions are going to last way longer than they actually do. So my dad is a Chicago Bears fan and has been for decades. And usually that means a lot of heartbreak because I don't think the Bears have been good since I was very, very young. And I have all these memories of every Sunday morning he'd wake up and say, if the Bears win today, I'm going to be so happy. I'm going to be happy all week. Or if they lose, the flip side, of course, but he's an optimist, is, I'm going to be crushed and I'm going to be crushed all week. And lo and behold, the Bears would often lose, but he would be fine by bedtime, so he got over it really quickly. And yeah, there's a lot of research on what some people call the psychological immune system, showing that, we're much more adaptive to the good and bad life events than we anticipate. And there are a couple reasons for that, but so people don't always know what's going to make them happy. And there are some instances, like for instance, what I study is how being generous can make us happy. We don't always find that people are aware of that, or they're not very clearly aware of it. They know in broad strokes that doing nice things for others makes them happy. But when push comes to shove and we offer them some very clear descriptions like, hey, would you take this? Do you think you'd be happier spending $5 or $20 on yourself or $5 or $20 on someone else? The overwhelming majority say they'd be happier spending money on themselves, which is the exact opposite of what we've found in dozens of studies. And so,
yeah, I love that. I love that experiment because I know you did that with students.
Yes.
And you asked them about spending money on yourself or spending money on others.
Mm-hmm.
And the students who actually did spend their $20 or $50 or whatever on other people were happier than the ones who spent it on themselves. So, yeah, what do we know? Because there seems to be quite a bit of evidence on generosity, right? And happiness.
Yeah, certainly financial. Yeah. So I got to, when you asked what makes people happy, I started by talking about social relationships, but I think another predictor is being generous to other people. Now, this is one place where, I feel very lucky. I've been able to study this for over a decade now. And my particular interest and where I started and where I continue to be studying is forms of financial generosity. So where people give sometimes, and in most of our experiments, they're relatively small amounts of money to another person. So I think the study you're mentioning was one of our first studies on the topic. It was years ago when I was in graduate school working with Elizabeth Dunn and Mike Norton. I went out on the morning hours on campus at UBC, and I invited students to take part in this study. And I said, if you want to participate, we're looking at everyday spending choices. And so you'll be randomly assigned to receive a certain amount of money. It was either $5 or $20. And randomly assigned to receive some spending instructions. And if they agreed, I pulled out an envelope. It had either $5 or $20 inside, and inside, tucked with it, were some spending instructions. So half of the participants were randomly assigned to spend the money on themselves. And they could buy a gift for themselves or cover a bill or expense, whatever they chose to do. And the other half were randomly assigned to spend the money on someone else by buying a gift or making a charitable donation. And we asked everybody to spend the money by 5 o'clock so that a research assistant who was unaware of the money they had received, the amount of money and the spending instructions they had received, could call them with a series of questions. And the key questions were how happy they were at the end of the day. And what we found was that participants randomly assigned to spend money on others were significantly happier than those who received money to spend on themselves. And the amount of money didn't matter so much. It was how they were assigned to spend it.
Oh, yeah, and significantly happier. See, now that makes me wonder about shopping therapy, because so many of us, when we feel sad, we're like, oh, well, we're just going to go run out and buy something for ourselves. We should be buying something for someone else.
Yeah, well, the evidence suggests that might be a more effective route. I mean, it's not to say that, my colleagues and I have never argued that, you should stop paying your rent and just go spend money.
Yeah, no.
But to say, if you find an extra $5 in your pocket or $20, or you're choosing, money is often finite for people, and you're making you're making choices about how to spend extra disposable income. The research does suggest that on average, people are happier when they spend on others than on themselves.
Yeah.
And those studies were done, years ago now, and we've since, we've replicated the result with much more sophisticated methods and controlled paradigms. And we've also been trying to push the boundaries of understanding how far this relationship might extend. Our original study was conducted with UBC undergraduates, which I think is a very reasonable place to begin, but they might not also represent humanity in many ways, right? Students are at an interesting point in their lives. Students are also at an interesting point financially, where, some are very financially independent and some are very much, tied to parents' income or support. And so one of the most frequent questions we received after publishing those initial results were, how generalizable is this phenomenon? Is this something that we might see in other places and in other cultural contexts and socioeconomic statuses? It seemed perfectly reasonable that when people have extra disposable income, at their fingertips, they might choose to, when they spend on others, they'd feel good about it. But maybe when resources are really tight, these emotional rewards might be dampened or even flipped, right? Maybe people would be happier spending on themselves. And so we worked with an international team of collaborators to really examine this question in both relatively rich and relatively poor nations. And we found the same basic effect. So people were happier spending on others than when they spent on themselves. We saw this through recollections in India, through recollections in Uganda, and also through a big spending experiment we ran in collaboration with folks in South Africa, and we also ran in Canada. And so my colleagues and I have argued that this might be a more fundamental feature of humans, that we feel good when we help others.
So, okay, wait a minute. You conducted these studies in poor nations as well, you say?
Yeah, we partnered with local collaborators. Yeah.
Was it actually conducted with people who maybe were struggling financially? I mean, really, like they didn't even have enough money, perhaps for some basic necessities, and yet did they still feel happier giving to others?
They did on average, yeah. So I think perhaps the most relevant study to mention is one that we conducted. We conducted one version of it in Canada, again with UBC students. They were our relatively wealthy sample, but we worked with collaborators in South Africa, in Cape Town, where we very intentionally recruited low-income students for a very similar experiment. And so, simply put, they were participants were recruited for this study. They came in, they were given kind of a paper questionnaire in which they were told that in addition to their show-up fee, they had earned a small sum of money. In Canada, it was the equivalent of $2.50. Like, this wasn't a lot of money. And in South Africa, it was the financial equivalent of, I believe it was 20 Rand at the time. And then we told them they didn't know the other condition, but with this extra bit of money that they had just earned, they could buy a goodie bag. Now, half of the people were randomly assigned to the generous condition, where they could use this money if they wanted to buy a goodie bag filled with treats like juice and chocolate for a sick kid at a children's hospital. And they could pick the contents. Or in the other condition, the personal spending condition, people were buying the same items to fill a goodie bag for themselves. And we gave them the opportunity to opt out because we didn't want them to feel forced to give, but almost everybody chose to buy the goods. After they did so, they reported their momentary happiness, excuse me, and we found, as we had seen in Canada before, people randomly assigned to this condition where almost everybody chose to buy a goodie bag for a sick kid reported feeling happier than people who bought the same items for themselves. And notably, our participants in Cape Town, I think it was close to 40% of them reported some significant financial strain, saying that they and their families had had trouble meeting their basic food needs in the past several months.
Yeah, it really does make one wonder and question the connection between happiness and money. Do you know, when you hear something like that, and money for yourself? There was a survey about how much money certain generations want in order to be financially comfortable, and I'm assuming, I guess, happy to a certain, financially happy anyway. And the survey was saying that millennials said they need to make over $500,000 a year. They were far ahead of the other generations that were surveyed, including Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen X, who ranged somewhere between $124,000 and $130,000 a year. So, you know, it made me wonder, like, I don't know, what do we know about how much money we need to make us happy?
It's a complicated question that has been studied by many psychologists and economists and even sociologists, scholars from many different disciplines. And my thoughts on this are kind of big and complex. I'll share a couple points that are floating through my mind. Is first and foremost, I think it would be hard to deny that there is an association between money and happiness. Typically, the more money people have, the happier they report feeling within nations. So, and even across nations too. The results actually tend to be a lot stronger if we look. People living in wealthier nations tend to report higher levels of happiness than people living in less wealthy nations. And part of that is because wealthier nations can provide a greater sense of infrastructure and safety and security. Access to clean water, for instance, makes a huge, meaningful impact on people's lives. But I think primarily what we're thinking about here, I'm guessing, was within even within a nation where the association between money and happiness tends to be a bit weaker, there is still, I think, some of the best evidence collected to date does suggest a positive association. That being said, it's complicated by many things. I think money provides many things. It can provide safety. It can provide freedom. It can provide, of course, access to important resources that people need. But it can also it's an opportunity for people to spend their money in ways that can bring happiness. Having more of it doesn't always necessarily translate to money well spent. And I think sometimes pursuing happiness at the cost of other more perhaps direct route to happiness can also be problematic. So just as money we talked about earlier is finite and people need to make some tough choices on how to spend that, time is also finite. And if you're spending all your time working towards earning a higher level of income, you might be making some meaningful sacrifices in ways that could be perhaps more rewarding for your happiness. And so, you could think about someone who might try to save money by living further away from where they work every day. And so that might lead to many hours of commute time and less time with family and friends. And so is saving the money worth the time away from friends and family? I think the reason would lead to some pause. I've seen really great examples offered by other scholars saying even in short-term decisions, we might make a trade-off. Ashley Willens and Elizabeth Dunn have developed a scale looking at whether people prioritize time and money, and give a really great example. There are many times where we might be choosing between a cheaper flight with a layover or a direct flight that gets us home early, to say hi to our partner or see our dog or put our kids to bed. And so, if you're prioritizing saving money, then you might miss those social opportunities. So all this to say,
that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about, excuse me. You're right. It's complicated because the choices we make can be good in one area, but then a sacrifice in another. I hadn't really thought about it in that way.
And there's also the complexity that simply just pursuing money as an end in and of itself, what researchers might often call materialism, is just trying to amass more things, more money, is also very negatively associated with happiness. And so there might be some kind of competing or pushback force where, having more money can be great because it can it can provide these safeties and opportunities, and it can provide support and opportunities for people to invest in others and maybe free their time to spend their time with others. But when it comes at the cost of sacrificing time with others and opportunities with others, that can be problematic. And it can also, I think, simply just pursuing money for an end in and of itself to simply just have more of it is probably not helpful for life.
Yeah. See, okay. So again, I think I'm guessing, but if you were to ask most people, do you think money buys happiness? They would say no. I think most people intellectually, if you were to ask them, they'd say, no, I know that money does not, a certain amount of money. Yes. But the point being, right, the end goal, no. But yet, see, this goes back to your point of, do we really know what makes us happy? Because so many of us pursue money as an end goal. We kill ourselves working. We try to make more money. We want to buy more material things with that money. Yet intellectually, knowing that that's ultimately not the most important thing to make us happy. But we do it. Like, why? Why do we go against what you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there are normative pressures. There's a lot of marketing and materialism kind of encouraging us to make money, to spend it, to have, we're promised that when we buy this car, when we buy this thing, when we have this house, when we live in this suburb, when we go on this vacation, that's when we'll finally have happiness. It reminds me and kind of speaks to one finding that's been studied in the science of happiness or well-being science literature called hedonic adaptation too. So there's this, sometimes people think that when I meet this particular goal, whether it be this income level, or it can even be in relationship terms, when I'm finally with this person, or when I find my partner, then I will finally be happy. But what tends to happen is, because humans are adaptive to things way more than we expect, when we reach those goals, when we reach this desired income of $150,000, it might be great for a few weeks. We adjust, all of a sudden we're going for more dinners. We can make these investments and choices, the things that we couldn't do before. But then we very quickly adapt to this new income level or to this new partner in our lives. And all of a sudden it starts to, fade to the background and we set our sights on something new. And so humans have a tendency to be chasing what might be, and adapt to what we have. And that can be, it can be productive in some sense. It can lead us to not being stale and to, have some kind of forward moving propulsion. But at the same time, it can hurt our happiness when we, are not grateful for the things that we have, but instead always unsatisfied looking for the next thing.
Oh, gosh. That reminds me, I had an interview and it was with a philosopher at UBC. I don't know if you know her. Her name is Carrie Jenkins.
No, I didn't know her.
She said something so interesting. She'd written a book and it was mostly about love, but happiness was a big part of it. And she made an argument that we have been conditioned to, quote unquote, pursue happiness. And that it's even in the American, what do you call it? Exactly, right? That, what is it? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
So she said that is such a Western concept, which is flawed because in her opinion, she felt that you can't chase happiness. You can't pursue it. That happiness is a byproduct of something, an action, of something that you do. And so she said it's almost like we're set up on this sort of errand, a fool's errand, that's only going to lead to disappointment or in the end, possibly unhappiness. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, well, I have a couple. I mean, I do agree that just like pursuing happiness as an end might not be as productive as making some meaningful choices about how we get there. And so, I think kind of tying into what we were just saying before, I don't think there's one kind of easy, quick fix for happiness. It's not just earning this much money. It's not just having a romantic partner or having children or having this car or being able to vacation in the Alps every year. It's not just one quick thing. I think happiness comes from, structuring our lives in ways that allow us to kind of connect with people we care about and pursue these like meaningful volitional activities that are frequent and enjoyable, and valuable not just to ourselves and to others.
Yeah. And just going back to some of that research too, I mean, we talked about meaningful relationships, about generosity to others. I've heard a lot about volunteerism, like volunteering. Is there evidence, good evidence behind that and happiness?
Well, so there are hundreds of studies, I would say, that have found that volunteers report higher levels of happiness than non-volunteers. But it's important to contextualize and to offer some caveats about why that might be. So it could very well be that, volunteering provides this real boost in happiness. It could be that happier people are more likely to volunteer. It could also be that volunteering just brings a whole bunch of other stuff that makes us happy. Like, for instance, a sense of meaning, or new relationships, or, like a sense of purpose and control. So it's not necessarily directly a predictor of happiness, but it brings about or co-occurs with all these other things. Importantly, up until recently, there were actually very few experiments that randomly assigned people to engage in volunteer work versus a meaningful control condition to really explore these questions. And to be honest, the few that I know of did not find striking evidence for the emotional benefits of volunteer work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It just means that a number of high quality studies are in the works, but have not been published yet. There are other forms of generosity, particularly financial generosity that I mentioned before. My colleagues and I have tried to do everything we can implementing these best practices to really interrogate our earlier work and see whether financial generosity leads to happiness. And I'm delighted to say that, after years of hard work, we found that it does. So we've run,
thank goodness for that.
we've run these large experiments with hundreds of people where we pre-registered all of our intentions and our analyses, and the findings were as we predicted. So
wow.
Even spending small amounts on others. Sorry.
Yeah, you know what? I want to get in for sure. The United Nations, World Happiness Report, because you've been a co-editor and you've worked on that. Tell me why it's important to, study happiness around the world and its connection to a country's success.
Sure. So some people argue, and I believe that it's important to know in and of itself because we care about how people are doing. But it's also, well-being is also an important predictor of success. So it turns out that individuals and communities and nations that report higher levels of well-being tend to show more success in multiple domains. So for individuals, that might be having more rewarding relationships, giving more to others, earning more money, being more creative in a whole number of venues. People who are happier tend to have more personal success. And generally speaking, the same is true for companies. Companies with happier employers happier employees tend to have less turnover, more creativity, higher performance in the stock market, and all these things. And the same is true for nations too, that countries that tend to have higher levels of well-being tend to perform well on economic indicators, but also, for instance, weather a lot of the international shocks better. And I think it's important to note that this might seem obvious, but it's also can be really counterintuitive, because I think our working understanding of happiness is that it flows from positive life events. We're happy because we have these, good relationships, these wins at work, these meaningful communities, or a successful quarter at work. But what a lot of the data has shown in a really nice review paper by Sonia Lubomirsky and colleagues from 2005 is that happiness doesn't just come from success; it predicts success. And I think that brings a lot of people also on board for why measuring happiness is important.
Lara, I could talk to you all day, and I feel as if we just scratched the surface. This is so fascinating, and I think super helpful to people. I really do. Thanks so much for joining us, and all the best with your work.
Thank you very much, and thanks for these really lovely questions.
Lara Aknin is a social psychologist. She's also a professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University, and she's a co-editor of the United Nations World Happiness Report, which comes out every year. If you'd like to know more about Lara's research, please check out our show notes. That is it for today's Cram podcast. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you are happy with this podcast, then we would love you to review us and follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Please join us in 2 weeks for our very last podcast of the year. But in the meantime, we wish you a happy holiday season.